When I arrived at the old hotel, I told myself it was just for closure. That's what I repeated out loud while unpacking my bag and placing it carefully on the dusty bed, even though no one was there to hear me. I wasn't here for reconciliation, I said. Not for him. And certainly not because my brother insisted I come. I told myself I was strong enough now, enough time had passed. But as I opened the wardrobe and saw my old red scarf still hanging, unmoved, untouched for over a decade, something in my chest shifted. The air in the room was thick with memory. I turned around, planning to leave, when I heard a car door slam outside. And then another. I went to the window, heart thudding for reasons I couldn't explain, and saw not one, but two people stepping out. My brother. And him. My ex-husband. The man I hadn't seen in over 10 years. The man who once broke something inside me I thought would never heal. My pulse quickened. I felt a strange heat rise to my face, not anger, not fear, but something far more confusing. I reached for my phone to text my brother, to ask what the hell this was, but found no service. No signal. Of course. Of course. That's when the door creaked open behind me. Footsteps. Familiar. Hesitant. My past had just walked back into the room. And that was only the beginning of everything I thought I had buried. Before I tell you the truth I've kept hidden for years, I want to ask you, have you ever stood face to face with a version of yourself you hoped never to see again? The moment I stepped across the threshold of that place, everything in me screamed to turn around. It was cold inside, not from the weather, but from something older, heavier. Time itself had thickened in the walls. The hotel had once been lively, a hidden gem in the hills where we spent our early anniversaries, where our families gathered in late summers before things fell apart. But now, it stood forgotten, with peeling paint and silence that echoed louder than any voice. I could hear my own footsteps like echoes of memories. My brother had insisted it would be good for me. Just a weekend, he said. To clear your mind. You need to face some things, not keep running. I didn't reply. What was I supposed to say? That I didn't want to face anything at all? That I was fine letting the past decay quietly in peace? But he knew me too well. He always had a way of getting me to agree to things I wasn't sure I wanted. I carried my single suitcase up the stairs. Room 203, the same room we always stayed in. The key, antique and rusted, turned in the lock with an unsettling ease, as though time had paused just for me to return. Dust covered the dresser, and a faint scent of lavender hung in the air. The bedspread was still the same, dark green with golden trim. I didn't sit. I stood in the middle of the room and stared. The longer I stood there, the more I remembered, not the loud fights, or the bitter silences at the end, but the softness that came before it. The way he used to trace my back with his fingers while I read, the smell of his skin after shaving, the way he would sing out of tune just to make me laugh. These weren't the memories I had planned to confront. And yet, they arrived anyway, uninvited. I stepped into the hallway and walked toward the kitchen on the first floor. The halls were dimly lit, and the windows bore streaks of dirt like tears. As I passed the common room, I caught sight of the old piano. It was covered with a white sheet, barely clinging to the corners. I ran my finger along the surface and picked up dust like old grief. Something inside me tightened. Why had I really come here? I was pouring water into a kettle when I heard tires on gravel outside. I froze. No one was supposed to be here. My brother was meant to join me later that evening, at least that's what he'd said in the last message. Curious, and more than a little uneasy, I walked to the window and moved the curtain aside. My breath caught. There he was. The man I had once vowed never to speak to again. The man who had left me when I needed him most. He hadn't changed much. A little more gray, a little slower in his movements, but his presence still pressed into the air like a weight. Beside him, my brother. They were talking. Casually. Comfortably. As though this had been the plan all along. I felt my heart pound in confusion and something darker. Was this a trick? A setup? I stepped back from the window and closed my eyes. The hotel spun slightly around me, like the walls themselves knew I was not in control. The front door creaked open, followed by footsteps. Then silence. I stayed in the kitchen, rooted in place. A few seconds later, my brother entered, holding 2 bags of groceries and acting as if nothing at all were strange. He was passing through, he said, as if that explained everything. I thought, maybe you two could talk. Or not. Up to you. Up to me. As though this place weren't charged with memories I hadn't consented to recall. As though I hadn't just been ambushed with a piece of my past I had spent years trying to silence. He left the bags on the counter and walked back out, whistling low under his breath. Moments later, I heard my ex-husband's voice behind me. It looks the same, he said quietly. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body had tensed, aware of him in the room with an intimacy that was maddening. Old muscle memory. I didn't know you'd be here, I said finally, keeping my voice even. Same. I turned slowly to face him. He looked tired. That made 2 of us. I guess your brother had his own plans, he added. I didn't respond. I didn't have words that made sense. Instead, I walked past him and carried the groceries into the pantry, one by one, just for something to do. Just to keep my hands busy. He didn't follow. He knew me well enough to leave space when needed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hotel creaked around me. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain start outside, soft and persistent. Memories danced on the edge of my mind like shadows. This place, this man, this feeling, it was all coming back too easily, too fast. And beneath it all, a single question repeated itself louder and louder. Why had my brother really brought us both here? And what was I supposed to do now that the past was sitting just 1 room away? I didn't yet know the answer. But I felt the tension beginning to rise. And somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this weekend would not go the way I thought. The next morning, the sunlight came reluctantly through the thin curtains, casting narrow bands of light across the wooden floor. I had barely slept, and what little rest I managed was shallow and dreamless. The silence in the hotel was thick, almost watchful, as though the walls were waiting for something to begin. I moved slowly, my body stiff from lying too long in one position, and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the old vanity mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired. Her hair was slightly tousled, her skin pale from lack of sleep. But her eyes, that was where the change was. They looked alert, searching, uneasy. Last night hadn't provided any clarity. If anything, it had stirred the waters of memory even more violently. I dressed quietly, choosing a navy blue sweater and dark pants, plain and unassuming. I didn't want to feel seen. I didn't want to draw attention. Yet, as I tied my hair back, I couldn't shake the sense that this day would demand something from me. Downstairs, the kitchen already smelled faintly of coffee. My brother stood at the counter, humming something low and tuneless as he poured 3 mugs. He turned when he saw me, his expression calm, almost cheerful. "Morning," he said, handing me a mug without waiting for an answer. "Figured we'd all need something hot." I nodded, taking the mug from his hand. Our fingers brushed, just for a second, and I pulled back too quickly. He noticed. Of course he did. The 3rd mug sat untouched on the table. A moment later, my ex-husband entered from the hallway, his shirt wrinkled and eyes shadowed by fatigue. He gave me a short nod, then sat down at the table without saying a word. My brother joined him. For a while, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock and the faint crackling of the stove's pilot flame. It should have been awkward, unbearable even, but it wasn't. Not yet. It was something else entirely, a pause before pressure. I was thinking, my brother finally said, glancing between the two of us, that maybe you two could spend some time together today. Walk the trails. Just talk. Clear the air. His tone was casual, but his eyes didn't match. They lingered on me a moment too long. I don't think that's necessary, I said flatly. My ex shifted in his seat. It might be, he added, not looking at me, not looking at him either. My brother leaned back in his chair. I just thought it might help. And then, as if it had been an afterthought, I'll head into town later. Give you space. I didn't respond. I focused on my coffee, though the bitterness had gone cold in my mouth. I didn't want space. I wanted answers. Why were we here, really? What was he trying to orchestrate? But I stayed quiet. Later that morning, the three of us went for a walk, following the gravel path that led down behind the hotel. It was a trail we had walked countless times in the past, lined with birch trees and scattered pine cones. The leaves crunched beneath our feet, and the chill of early autumn clung to my skin despite my sweater. We didn't talk much. My brother walked ahead, humming again, as if determined to seem harmless. My ex-husband and I trailed behind, keeping a careful distance between our strides. Every so often, our shoulders would almost touch, and one of us would shift away slightly. It was a silent dance, old habits pressing against the new boundaries. At one point, we stopped near the edge of the lake. The water was still, a perfect mirror of the pale blue sky. My brother wandered off into the trees with a vague promise to give us some time. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. I watched the ripples in the water from a passing breeze and tried to suppress the weight in my chest. It's strange being back here, he said finally. Yes, I replied. I didn't know he'd invited you too. Not until yesterday. I looked at him. His hands were in his coat pockets, and his gaze was fixed on the water. He told me you asked to come, I said quietly. He turned to me. That's not true. I believed him. And that scared me more than I expected. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what this was. Why would he do this? He didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he did, and didn't want to say. We walked back to the hotel in silence. When we arrived, the driveway was empty. My brother's car was gone. As promised, he had left. Inside, the air was warmer now. The sun had climbed higher, and its light cut through the dusty windows, giving the place a glow that almost felt kind. I went upstairs to change. When I returned, I found my ex-husband sitting at the piano in the common room, the cover pulled back and keys exposed. He wasn't playing. Just staring. He kept this covered all these years, I said, walking slowly into the room. I didn't even remember it was here. I sat down across from him, keeping the piano between us. There's a lot I didn't remember either. Until yesterday. He didn't look at me. You seemed surprised. When you saw me. I was. He finally met my eyes. Was it a bad surprise? I hesitated. I don't know yet. We didn't say anything more after that. Eventually, I left him there and went to the kitchen to start preparing something to eat. There was little in the cupboards, a few cans, a loaf of bread, some eggs that somehow hadn't gone bad. I stood at the stove, cracking eggs into a pan, when I heard footsteps behind me. I knew whose they were before I turned. My brother stepped into the kitchen, holding a bottle of red wine. "Thought we could use something to take the edge off," he said, smiling lightly. I glanced at the clock. "It's not even noon." He shrugged. "It's past noon somewhere." I didn't laugh. I returned to the stove, stirring the eggs with a wooden spoon. He moved beside me, too close. I could feel the heat of his body radiating through the space between us. He reached for a plate from the cabinet above me, and as he did, his hand brushed my shoulder, too deliberately. I flinched slightly. He didn't comment. He handed me the plate and let his hand rest a second longer than necessary before pulling away. I turned off the stove and set the pan aside. "You said you were going into town." "I did." He took a step closer. "But plans change." The silence grew heavy. Then, without warning, he reached forward and gently took the plate from my hands. Our fingers touched. We kissed. The air felt thicker after it happened, like something unspoken had been released into the room, then immediately trapped again. I pulled away first. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the dish towel, pretending to wipe my hands. He didn't move. Just stood there, watching me in a way that was both familiar and alien. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I felt like my skin didn't fit right anymore, like I'd stepped into someone else's life by mistake. The sound of footsteps creaking from upstairs snapped the silence like a taut string. My ex-husband had returned to the hallway, maybe hearing voices, maybe suspecting something. I stepped away from the stove and busied myself stacking plates on the counter, even though I had no plan for lunch. My brother stepped back too, casually now, like nothing had happened. Like what had just passed between us wasn't deeply wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate yet. I heard my ex's footsteps pass the kitchen door, then retreat upstairs. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. I could feel the warmth still lingering on my lips, and the echo of something I didn't want to name in the pit of my stomach. I stayed in the kitchen a long time after my brother left, staring at the floor tiles like they might offer an escape. The same tiles we used to dance on when the hotel was full of music and people. The same tiles where my niece spilled juice on her birthday and cried like it was the end of the world. My body remembered things I hadn't thought about in years. The way my brother's hand felt against mine. The way my heart used to race when I heard someone say my name with intention. I thought I had buried all of that beneath years of responsibility, maturity, grief. Apparently not deep enough. When I finally stepped out into the hallway, the house felt quieter than before. Not peaceful, empty. I walked through the common area, brushing my fingers along the dusty mantel. There were framed photos still there. I avoided looking too closely. Some doors were open, others closed. I wasn't sure if they were closed by people or by time. In the afternoon, I found myself sitting on the back porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The lake shimmered in the distance, still and glassy, a deceptive calm. My ex-husband joined me sometime later, sitting on the opposite side of the porch swing, as far from me as the structure allowed. He didn't say anything for a long time. I could feel his hesitation like a weight. "I didn't expect this," he said finally. I didn't ask what he meant. I had a dozen guesses. He continued. "Being here. It's more complicated than I thought it would be." That was the understatement of the year. I gave him a faint nod but said nothing. "I keep thinking about how we left things," he said, watching the lake. All the words we never said. The silence we used as a shield. Still, I said nothing. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not after what had happened earlier. My thoughts were too tangled, too raw. He took my silence as permission to keep talking. I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving back then. I really did. But looking at you now, I wonder if I just didn't know how to stay. I turned slightly, just enough to glance at him. He looked older in profile. Tired, but not broken. Regret sat on him like an old coat. You left because I stopped being easy, I said quietly, surprising even myself with the words. Because life stopped being light and pretty and romantic. Because I started needing things from you that you didn't know how to give. He didn't argue. He nodded slowly. Yeah. That's probably true. We fell into silence again. But it wasn't the cold, dead silence of old resentment. It was warmer. Honest. I didn't know what to do with that. Later, I found myself alone again, walking the halls upstairs. I paused outside a room I hadn't entered yet. It had once been used as a game room for the kids. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Dust motes spun in the shaft of light from the window. The air smelled faintly of mold and wood polish. Inside, everything was just as we had left it. A broken foosball table, a sagging couch, boxes of board games stacked in the corner. I walked slowly, touching things, trying to remember who I was when this place mattered. Trying to find a version of myself before the divorce, before the bitterness, before the loneliness turned into something like routine. I sat on the couch and leaned my head back, closing my eyes. The quiet pressed in again. It didn't feel heavy now. It felt necessary. My body had been in motion for too long, trying to be okay, trying to pretend, trying to carry it all without crumbling. Maybe here, in this decaying shell of something that once was whole, I could stop trying for a while. Eventually, the sun dipped lower, and shadows began to stretch across the floor. I returned to my room and stood at the window, watching the last of the light sink behind the trees. My brother was outside, stacking firewood. He moved methodically, calmly, like a man with nothing on his conscience. That bothered me more than I expected. Dinner was quiet. The three of us sat at the long table like strangers trying to pretend they weren't. We ate in near silence, save for the clink of silverware and the occasional cough. I avoided looking at either of them for too long. Afterward, I stayed to clean up. My brother offered to help, but I waved him off. I needed the space. He respected that, or at least pretended to. My ex disappeared into the back library, the only room still filled with books and the scent of old paper. Alone in the kitchen, I scrubbed dishes with more force than necessary. I wasn't angry exactly. But I was unsettled. Unmoored. That kiss. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to categorize it. Was it an accident? A moment of weakness? Or something deliberate, something that had been building quietly for longer than I was willing to admit? I dried the plates and stacked them carefully, one by one. Each motion gave me something to focus on, something other than the heat still flickering in my chest. I needed clarity. I needed distance. But neither was available here. Not with the past walking around in flesh and memory. Not with temptation and regret seated at my dinner table. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for hours. The sounds of the house at night, creaking floors, settling wood, occasional groans from the pipes, felt like whispers. I stared at the ceiling and tried to will my body to stillness, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. Something had shifted today. And I had no idea where it would lead. Morning arrived without fanfare. The sky outside the window was a flat, pale gray, and the clouds hung low, as if pressing against the trees with quiet weight. I felt the same, heavy in places I hadn't noticed before. The previous day lingered in my mind like fog. I had expected confusion, but not this specific kind. I hadn't imagined I would feel fractured in this way, unsure which direction would lead me back to something resembling myself. I didn't leave the room immediately. Instead, I sat at the small wooden chair by the window, a cold cup of tea in my hands, watching the wind stir the surface of the lake. There was something hypnotic about the movement. A rhythm that didn't require answers or confrontation. Just presence. That was more than I could say for the rest of this house. Eventually, the quiet turned oppressive. I couldn't hide upstairs all day, and I knew that. My body ached as I rose. My reflection in the mirror looked more distant than usual, not older, not necessarily sadder, but untethered. Like the person looking back was still waiting to fully arrive. Downstairs, I found the kitchen empty. A note rested on the counter, written in my brother's neat script, "Went for supplies. Back before dark." I stared at it for a moment. There was no mention of where. No phone number, not that reception worked out here. Just that calm handwriting, so familiar, and now so unreadable to me. The house was too still. Every step I took on the hardwood floor seemed too loud. I wandered through rooms like I was walking through someone else's memories, half mine, half faded. The curtains in the lounge had been drawn back, letting in more of the flat gray light. I stood there for a while, thinking I would sit, maybe read, distract myself. But my eyes kept drifting to the hallway, toward the closed door of the room where my ex-husband had spent the night. I didn't go to him. Not yet. Instead, I stepped outside. The air bit at my cheeks, but it felt cleaner than the air inside the house. I walked without any direction, following the overgrown path toward the lake. The trail wound through tall grass and thin trees that had begun to lose their leaves, little golden pieces scattered like brittle memories across the ground. There was an old bench by the water, weathered, missing one slat. We had sat there years ago, all three of us. Me, my brother, and him. A late summer evening, fireflies blinking between us, laughter that felt easy then. I wondered who I had been that night. What she would think of me now. I sat, even though the wood was damp. I didn't care. The lake was calm again, a perfect mirror of nothing. I stared at my reflection, distorted by ripples, and thought of the kiss again. Of how quickly it had happened. How familiar it had felt. That was what disturbed me most, the familiarity. Like something I had always known, even if I had never acknowledged it. I didn't have words for that. Only sensation. I stayed there until the cold began to sink through my clothes, then made my way back slowly, footsteps crunching against dead leaves. As I reached the house, I saw him through the window, my ex, standing near the fireplace, poking at embers with an iron rod. There was no fire, only ash. I paused before entering, watching him. There was something tired about his stance, as though he was trying to will the heat back into something that had long gone out. When I stepped inside, he turned. We exchanged no words. Just a glance, cautious, curious, unfinished. I walked past him into the kitchen. It still smelled like last night's wine. A dull ache formed behind my eyes as I remembered that moment with my brother, the plate, the closeness, the electric wrongness that had pulsed between us. It hadn't been romantic. It hadn't been tender. It had been something else entirely, something uninvited, but not entirely unreciprocated. And that was what I couldn't make peace with. I pulled a glass from the cupboard and filled it with tap water. My hands shook slightly as I drank. I set the glass down and leaned against the sink, my fingers pressing into the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. Behind me, I heard him speak for the first time since breakfast. "I'm not sure why we're here," he said, voice low. "But I think your brother's trying to push something." I didn't turn around. "You think?" He sighed. "He keeps watching us like we're a game he started but forgot how to finish." I turned then, slowly, and leaned against the sink. Maybe he never wanted to finish it. He looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, not affection, not regret, but wariness. As if he was beginning to realize he wasn't the only one carrying pieces of the past into the present. We didn't speak again for a while. He returned to the common room, and I stayed in the kitchen, trying to organize my thoughts. But they refused. They slid away the moment I tried to pin them down. In the afternoon, I returned to my room and opened the small suitcase I had barely unpacked. I sat on the bed and stared at the few items I had brought. Clothes, books, a small framed photo of my son that I kept tucked inside an inner pocket. I pulled it out now, stared at his face, that smile, those eyes. So far removed from the chaos that surrounded me now. He had no idea who I had been, who I was before he was born. And maybe I didn't either. I placed the photo on the nightstand and lay back, closing my eyes. I didn't sleep, but I drifted, not into dreams, but into flashes. The warmth of a familiar hand, the weight of silence, the image of my brother's eyes just inches from mine, and the feeling of my ex's presence always on the edge of a room. I came back to myself when I heard the car outside. My brother had returned. I stayed upstairs while he unpacked whatever he'd brought, bags rustling, cabinet doors opening and closing. He moved through the house like it still belonged to him. Like he had never left. Eventually, I descended the stairs. He looked up when he saw me and smiled. Not sheepishly. Not apologetically. Just the smile he always gave me. The one that had comforted me since I was a girl. Now it felt like a mask. I brought your favorite, he said, lifting a jar of olives. I nodded, said thank you, and walked past him into the living room. We didn't talk much that evening. The three of us ate quietly, the tension palpable but unspoken. The rain began again, tapping against the windows in a steady rhythm. I watched it, grateful for the distraction. For the way it masked the silence between us. That night, in bed, I stared at the ceiling again. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in the kitchen. Not because I missed it, not because I wanted to repeat it, but because I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what I had allowed. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what I had done, or what I might still do. And somewhere, underneath it all, a terrible question had begun to form, one I wasn't ready to answer. What if he had planned all of this not for us to reconcile, but for something else entirely? Something I couldn't yet name. The following day began without color. A thick mist hung over the lake, dulling the edges of the trees and turning the view from my window into a watercolor of grays and faint outlines. I sat at the edge of the bed, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, trying to summon the will to move. It wasn't just exhaustion anymore, it was something deeper. A mental inertia. The kind that creeps in when you've let too many things happen without truly understanding why. I dressed in silence. A soft turtleneck sweater and black jeans. Comfortable clothes, but not careless. I pulled my hair back, not out of vanity, but because it gave me a sense of order. Something small I could control. The rest of my life felt anything but controlled. Downstairs, the scent of toast and coffee hinted that someone had already started the day. I found my ex-husband in the kitchen, seated at the table with a steaming mug cupped in his hands. He didn't look up when I entered, and I didn't greet him. We existed in a fragile kind of truce, held together by mutual confusion and the memory of what we used to be. My brother wasn't in sight. That gave the morning a strange lightness, an illusion of privacy that neither of us fully trusted. I made myself a cup of tea, moving around him with the silent precision of someone avoiding emotional proximity. He stayed still, watching the steam rise from his cup like it held answers. I was thinking about leaving today, he said finally, his voice low, almost tentative. I didn't respond right away. The idea of him leaving sent a ripple through me, not relief, not sorrow, but something in between. It felt like a page turning before I'd finished reading. I stirred my tea. Why haven't you? He glanced at me then, eyes searching. Maybe I'm waiting for you to ask me to stay. I didn't say anything. I wasn't ready to answer that kind of question. Not when I didn't even know where I stood with myself, let alone with him. After breakfast, I went for a walk alone. The mist was lifting slowly, revealing the trail through the woods and patches. The earth was damp beneath my shoes, and the air was crisp enough to sting the inside of my nose. I walked without direction, letting my body choose the path. My thoughts trailed behind me like a tired dog. When I returned, I heard voices from the back porch. My brother and my ex were speaking in quiet tones, just out of earshot. I paused near the kitchen doorway, hidden by the frame. I wasn't eavesdropping, not intentionally, but something in me resisted walking into their shared space. Their conversation was clipped, with pauses that said more than words. Then I heard my brother laugh. A short, dry sound. Not cruel. But not light either. I backed away quietly, returning upstairs. My room felt safer now, though I knew that was an illusion. Nothing in this house was safe. Not when everything from my past seemed to be walking the halls alongside me. I sat at the desk near the window and opened my journal. The pages had remained blank since the first night. I hadn't been able to write. But now, I picked up the pen and began, not with poetry or introspection, but with facts. What had happened? What had been said? What I had felt. I didn't judge the words, I just recorded them. It was the only way I could make sense of what was happening. Sometime in the afternoon, I heard the soft knock at my door. I knew who it was before I answered. He stood there, my brother, holding 2 mugs. One was clearly for me. I accepted it without speaking. He stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation. That small presumption, once comforting, now pressed against me with quiet force. I thought we could talk, he said. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We sat opposite each other, the desk chair and the bed, like opponents at a negotiation table. He sipped his drink before continuing. You've been quiet, he said. More than usual. I looked out the window. There's a lot to be quiet about. He tilted his head slightly. You've always carried too much inside. You don't have to. His words were gentle, but they unsettled me. They reminded me of childhood days when he'd pull me out of trouble, shield me from things, fix what I'd broken. I used to love him for that. Now I wasn't sure what to call it. I didn't ask you to bring him here, I said finally. I know. And yet, you did. I thought it would help, he replied, too quickly. I stood up then, suddenly needing movement. The room felt tighter with him in it. I paced slowly, my mug still warm in my hand. You say you wanted to help, I said, voice steadier now. But it feels like you're watching us. Waiting for something. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. What do you think I'm waiting for? I didn't answer. I didn't want to say the truth out loud. I didn't want to give it form. Instead, I said, I think you're enjoying this too much. He didn't deny it. That scared me more than anything. The silence stretched between us until I couldn't bear it. I walked past him, out of the room, down the hall, and into the kitchen. I needed space. Air. Something ordinary to anchor me. But he followed. I turned around, ready to ask him to leave me alone. Ready to tell him to stop circling me like some patient predator. But before I could speak, he stepped closer. Not aggressively. Not romantically. Just close. We kissed, he said quietly. And you didn't pull away. The words landed between us like stones dropped into still water. I stared at him. That wasn't supposed to happen. But it did. I took a slow breath, then another. I wanted to yell, to cry, to explain. But all I could do was say the only truth I had. I don't know what it meant. He nodded. Maybe it didn't have to mean anything. But we both knew that wasn't true. Later that evening, I found myself in the old library. My ex had fallen asleep in one of the armchairs, a book resting on his chest. I sat across from him, watching the slow rise and fall of his breathing. This man had once been my whole world. Now, he was a reminder of how much I had changed, and how far I had drifted from the woman I used to be. I wanted to believe I could rebuild something with him. That the past could be a foundation, not just a shadow. But every time I tried to move in that direction, another part of me pulled back, uncertain, tangled in the weight of what had already begun. As night settled over the house again, I stood at the window, watching the fog return. It moved like a tide, swallowing the trees and the lake, erasing the lines between what was real and what was memory. And still, I couldn't stop wondering, what if all of this was exactly what my brother wanted? And what if, despite everything, a part of me didn't want to leave? The air inside the house had changed. Not noticeably, not in temperature or scent, but in pressure, something unspoken had settled thickly into the rooms. Each sound echoed a little longer, every silence felt heavier. I moved through it carefully, as if walking across cracked ice. The rhythm of the days had collapsed into something I no longer understood. Morning blurred into evening, and the hours between belonged more to memory than action. I woke before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because my sleep had become fragmented, full of shifts and starts and images that left no clear imprint. I lay in bed for some time, watching the light move slowly across the ceiling, my thoughts circling a point I couldn't yet articulate. There was no peace and stillness anymore. Only noise, quietly ringing beneath everything. Eventually I rose, dressed in layered clothes for warmth, and descended the stairs. I didn't expect anyone to be awake yet, but the kitchen light was on. My brother stood at the counter, pouring hot water into a teapot as if this were any other ordinary day. He looked up as I entered, offered a small nod, not quite a greeting, not quite an acknowledgement. Just that. I took a seat at the table, wrapping my hands around the ceramic mug he placed in front of me without asking. He knew how I liked my tea. That fact, once comforting, now unsettled me. We sat in silence, the kind that feels deliberate, curated. He didn't speak, and neither did I. The quiet stretched until it nearly broke. And yet, neither of us filled it. Eventually, I stood and walked out without a word, the mug still warm in my hands. I went outside, letting the cold sting my skin. The frost had settled on the wooden porch railing, silvering the surface. I traced a finger through it absent-mindedly, watching the lines melt under my touch. Across the lake, the horizon was beginning to bleed with pale light. I didn't know what to do with myself anymore. There was no clarity, no decision I trusted. Every step I took felt provisional, like I was waiting for someone to stop me, or guide me, or explain what the rules were now. By midday, my ex and I found ourselves in the same room again. The living room had grown colder. We both sat, separated by the long coffee table and the space of too many years. We didn't speak. Our presence was enough to fill the room with tension. He shifted in his seat, not looking at me directly. "Have you thought about what happens after this?" he asked finally. The question lingered. I didn't answer. He continued. "Because I have. And I don't think this place is helping either of us." I swallowed hard. I could feel the truth in his words, but I couldn't face it yet. Not with everything still unresolved. not with the weight of the past thick in the air and the present pulling in too many directions. Later, I wandered into the library again, not to read, but to think. The scent of old pages and wood polish gave the room a strange kind of comfort. I sat in the same chair I had taken the day before and stared at the window. Rain tapped lightly against the glass. I closed my eyes and thought of the kiss. Not just the moment itself, but the days leading to it. The way he looked at me lately, the way his presence followed me into rooms. It wasn't love. It wasn't longing. It was something older. Something that had always been there, buried under family, under boundaries we never voiced. I had never dared to look at it clearly before. Now it demanded my attention. I hated that I didn't hate it. In the late afternoon, I found him in the hallway, pulling clean linens from a cabinet. He handed them to me with a smile that said nothing. His eyes lingered too long. I turned away. That evening, my ex found me in the kitchen while I was preparing something simple, a pot of soup, sliced bread, butter on a plate. He didn't comment on my distance. He didn't need to. It was obvious. He leaned against the counter, watching me in silence. "I think I should leave," he said eventually. "This place. It's not bringing anything good anymore." I stirred the soup, not looking at him. My voice felt slow when I finally answered. "You're probably right." He waited. Maybe for me to say more. Maybe for me to ask him to stay. I didn't. After he left the kitchen, I stood for a long time staring at the stove, the pot slowly bubbling. I didn't know why I hadn't stopped him. Maybe I believed he wouldn't really go. Maybe I hoped he would. Maybe I had already let go, quietly, days ago. Dinner passed in near silence again. Just the two of us. My brother made light conversation, small talk about the road into town, the state of the firewood, the noise in the attic. I responded where needed, nodded where it was polite. But inside, my mind was somewhere else entirely. I kept thinking about how it all began. About the moment I agreed to come here. About the phone call where my brother said, "It's just a weekend. It'll be good for you." About how I hadn't asked enough questions. About how easily I'd said yes. I told myself it was to heal. But maybe it was to feel. Anything. After dinner, we stayed in the lounge longer than usual. He poured us each a glass of wine. The lights were dim. The radio in the background played something soft and unobtrusive. We sat side by side on the worn sofa. I felt the weight of his presence in the cushions. Neither of us touched the other. But the space between us was too narrow to ignore. Too alive. He talked about the past, not in grand stories, but in fragments. About summer days. About the way I used to laugh at things that weren't funny. About how the house felt different when I was in it. His voice was careful, measured. I didn't answer much. I listened, unsure what he was trying to build. Then he said it. "He doesn't know you anymore." The sentence landed like a pebble dropped in a still pond. I turned to look at him. His face was calm, open, but there was something else behind his eyes. Something expectant. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't agree. We sat in silence, the wine untouched in my glass. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the room was dimming with it. When I finally stood to leave, he didn't stop me. He watched, but didn't speak. Back in my room, I stood at the window, staring out at the night. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. The stars were hidden. I was tired, not just in my body, but in my thoughts. Tired of feeling pulled in directions that never offered answers. But tomorrow, I knew, would bring something decisive. It had to. Because the distance between the people in this house could no longer hold. Something would have to break. Or I would. The morning began with a silence that felt deliberate. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a house still asleep, nor the stillness of nature wrapped in mist. It was thicker than that. Intentional. As though the building itself had chosen to hold its breath. I lay awake long before dawn, eyes open in the darkness, aware of every creak in the floorboards, every small shift of the wooden frame as wind touched the outer walls. I hadn't slept much, and the little rest I had managed felt more like drifting than dreaming. When I finally sat up, the bed sheets were tangled around my legs like they'd been fighting me through the night. I pushed them away and stood, stretching muscles that ached not from exertion, but from stillness. Outside the window, the sky was a slate gray, neither dark nor light, a canvas waiting for color that wouldn't come. I dressed slowly, choosing a long wool cardigan over my clothes, the kind that wrapped the body without asking questions. My mind was quiet, not in clarity but in fatigue. Thoughts had worn themselves down into something numb. I didn't feel peaceful, just stripped bare. When I descended the stairs, the house was still. I passed the kitchen, empty. The sitting room, untouched. No sound came from upstairs, and I assumed my ex was still in bed, or maybe already gone. He'd said he might leave. I hadn't asked him again. Maybe that was an answer in itself. I made tea in silence, my hands moving automatically. I didn't think about what I was doing. The kettle boiled. I poured. I stirred. I waited. I sipped. The ritual brought no comfort, but it filled the time. Eventually, I walked to the back of the house and opened the door to the small patio overlooking the lake. The cold hit me like a wall, but I welcomed it. It reminded me I still had a body, that I could still feel something real. I stepped outside, mug in hand, and stood at the railing. The lake was glass. Not a ripple. The trees on the far side were bare now, their reflections doubled in the water like ghosts. I felt no desire to move, no impulse to turn back inside. The air was bracing and honest, and I let it bite at my skin. Then I heard the door open behind me. I didn't turn. I knew it was him before he said anything. He stood beside me, not touching, not speaking. Just there. Like always. Like lately. For a long time, we stood in silence. It wasn't charged, not immediately. It was heavy, but not because of what we had done, because of what still hadn't happened. Finally, he spoke. You didn't sleep. It wasn't a question. I shook my head slightly. I could tell, he added. Your light was on most of the night. I didn't respond. I kept my eyes on the water. I don't want to make things harder for you, he said after a pause. I closed my eyes. The wind shifted slightly, brushing across my face. I still didn't speak. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't betray something I wasn't ready to confront. Eventually, we went back inside. The house was warmer, but it felt less forgiving than the air outside. We sat in the living room with the fireplace lit but not crackling. The logs had been burning long enough to create heat but no sound. I watched the flames quietly, my hands wrapped around my mug, even though the tea inside had long since gone cold. He sat across from me, elbows on his knees, his eyes downcast. I knew he was waiting for something, a word, a permission, a confession. I think I need to leave, I said finally. He looked up. Now? I nodded. Today. Maybe later. Maybe tomorrow morning. But I don't think I can stay here much longer. He didn't argue. He simply nodded. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Does he know? He asked quietly. I looked away. No, I said. And I don't think he ever should. He sat back slowly, exhaling through his nose. His expression didn't change much, but I sensed something in his posture, acceptance, maybe. Or disappointment. "I'll help you pack if you need it," he offered. I nodded. "Thank you." But I didn't move. Neither did he. We sat for another long stretch, the fire casting shadows against the old wooden walls. As the day unfolded, the house remained mostly silent. We moved around each other like dancers in a slow, unpracticed choreography. I began folding clothes, placing them back into the suitcase I had barely touched since I arrived. Every motion felt like a decision. Every sweater, every folded item, every object I placed back into the case felt like I was reclaiming something. Around late afternoon, I went down to the kitchen again to gather a few things. My ex was outside, pacing slowly near the lake's edge. I watched him through the window, wondering what he was thinking. Wondering how much he knew, or suspected. Wondering if it mattered anymore. Behind me, the floor creaked. I didn't need to turn to know it was my brother. He entered the room like he belonged there, moving toward the counter where a bottle of wine sat open. He poured himself a glass, took a slow sip, then leaned back against the sink. "You're leaving," he said flatly. I didn't answer. I suppose I should have expected it. Still, I said nothing. I stared at the countertop, at the marks in the wood, at the place where the finish had worn away from years of hands and time. He stepped closer. "You know I didn't plan for things to go this way." I turned slowly to face him. "Didn't you?" He held my gaze, but his eyes betrayed something he rarely showed, uncertainty. Not guilt. Not shame. Just the momentary awareness that things had slipped from his control. "I wanted you to remember," he said. "Who you were. What mattered to you." "You wanted me to remember you," I corrected. His jaw tightened slightly. "Maybe." I shook my head. "You should have just asked." Silence again. Then, his voice, quieter now. "Would you have said yes?" I didn't answer. Because that answer was not one I was willing to live with, let alone speak aloud. Later, the house grew darker as the sun slipped below the ridge of trees. I returned to my room, closed the suitcase, and sat on the edge of the bed. I stared at the door for a long time, half expecting it to open, half hoping it wouldn't. I wasn't sure what I was leaving behind. Only that I had to go. And before the night ended, before anything else could be said or undone, we spent the night together. The next morning arrived like an unwelcome guest, early, uninvited, and too loud in its stillness. I woke with the strange heaviness of knowing that something irreversible had taken place. Not just in the night, but across the last several days. Like a slow erosion that had finally collapsed part of the shoreline I had clung to for years. I didn't move right away. The room felt different now. The light looked the same, filtered through the same curtains, falling across the same rug. But everything inside me had shifted. The silence wasn't peace anymore. It was consequence. And it settled over my skin like a second layer. I rose slowly, avoiding the mirror. I didn't want to see my own face. Not yet. My movements were quiet, cautious, as if sound itself might force me to confront things I hadn't found the words for. The sheets on the bed were still warm. The room still carried traces of the night. But I didn't let myself linger on those details. I couldn't. I washed my face with cold water from the sink and got dressed without thinking about what I put on. Just layers. Something neutral. Something safe. I pulled my hair back quickly, then paused at the door before opening it. The hallway was quiet. No footsteps, no voices, no movement from the other rooms. Downstairs, the kitchen was already awake. My brother stood at the stove, flipping something in a pan. He looked up when I entered. There was no smile. No greeting. Just a slight incline of the head. A gesture that could mean anything. I sat at the table, my hands folded around a cup of tea I didn't remember making. The warmth grounded me. I focused on the sensation, not the thoughts behind it. Not the memories from a few hours ago. Just the warmth. He placed a plate in front of me. Eggs, toast, fruit. Too much food. I stared at it without touching it. Across the table, he picked up his own fork and began to eat in silence. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say in that moment that wouldn't open a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Then came the sound of a suitcase while dragging across the floorboards above. A steady, unmistakable rhythm. I froze. My brother looked up too, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Moments later, my ex appeared in the kitchen doorway, suitcase in hand, his coat zipped to the top, scarf neatly wrapped. He looked at me first. Not with accusation. Not even with sadness. Just with something resigned. I'm heading out, he said quietly. I nodded. Okay. He hesitated. I left you a note. On the desk upstairs. All right. He didn't approach me. Didn't offer a goodbye hug or a parting glance at my brother. He simply stepped back, suitcase wheels softly clicking against the floor as he walked toward the front door. Then the click of the latch. The sound of the door opening, then closing. A gust of cold air. And he was gone. I didn't get up. I didn't follow. I didn't even breathe for several seconds after the silence returned. Across from me, my brother picked up his cup and took a sip of coffee as if nothing at all had happened. Do you feel lighter? He asked after a while. The words landed with more weight than I expected. I looked up slowly, studying his expression. There was no smugness in his voice. But there was something else, something close to satisfaction, masked behind calm. No, I said. I don't. He nodded as if that was the answer he expected. Not disappointed. Just aware. I thought maybe you would, he said. Sometimes we don't realize how much space someone takes up until they leave it. I pushed the plate away and stood up. I don't want to talk, I said. He didn't stop me. I went upstairs, my legs heavier than usual, the walls narrowing around me with every step. The room felt colder now, despite the morning light. I saw the envelope immediately, a simple folded note on the desk, my name written in his familiar, slanted handwriting. I sat slowly and opened it. It wasn't long. Just a few sentences. Measured. Careful. Honest. He wrote that he hadn't come to the house expecting anything. That at first he thought this might be a mistake. But that being here, even in all its discomfort, had helped him see things clearly. He wrote that he still cared. That maybe a part of him always would. But that whatever we'd shared belonged to another time. Another version of ourselves. And that maybe we both needed to finally let go. He ended with a wish for peace. Not forgiveness. Not hope. Just peace. I folded the note and placed it back on the desk. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad. Not in the way I thought I would. There was only a quiet ache in my chest, the kind that comes when something has settled into truth. Later, I went outside. The wind had picked up, shaking loose a few final leaves from the trees. They skittered across the driveway like small creatures trying to escape winter. The car was gone. The gravel still bore the faint lines of the tires that had carried him away. I stood there a long time, the cold biting at my cheeks, my breath visible in short, shallow clouds. The quiet around me wasn't heavy anymore. It was just there. Honest. Present. Back inside, the house felt bigger now. Not empty. Just different. I walked slowly through the rooms, stopping occasionally to look at the details I hadn't noticed before, a crack in the wall near the fireplace, a loose floorboard by the stairs, a burn mark on the kitchen counter from an old pan. This place had never been perfect. But it had held our lives. Our memories. Our conflicts. Our silences. And now, it held the aftermath of everything we didn't say. That evening, my brother didn't speak much. He moved quietly, offering me tea, placing a blanket on the back of my chair, making sure the fire stayed lit. It was a kind of intimacy that made me uncomfortable now, not because of what had happened between us, but because of what hadn't. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask questions. He simply existed near me, orbiting with practiced distance. I watched him move through the space and wondered, not for the first time, how much of this he had anticipated. How much of it he had wanted. And how much of it I had allowed without understanding why. That night, I sat by the window in my room long after the house had gone quiet. The moon hung low over the lake, its reflection broken by ripples. Somewhere out there was a version of my life I might have chosen. One with fewer shadows. One where silence wasn't the loudest thing in the room. But that version was gone now. And in its place, only the truth remained. Quiet, heavy, and mine. I left before sunrise. The sky was still a bruised shade of blue when I zipped my suitcase and carried it quietly down the stairs. I moved carefully, deliberately, trying not to disturb the sleeping house. Each step creaked under my weight, and though I told myself no one would hear, a part of me still listened for movement behind the doors. None came. The hallway felt colder than usual. Or maybe I was simply aware of everything in a different way. Every wall. Every mark on the floor. Every object I passed held a memory now, not just of what had once been, but of what had shifted over these last few days. There was no longer a version of this place untouched by what had happened. I paused near the fireplace, where the embers had gone out hours ago. The room smelled of burnt wood and old dust. I placed the folded note on the mantel, short, neutral, a sentence or two to say I had gone. Not because I owed it, but because leaving without a word felt too final, too theatrical. I didn't want drama. I wanted closure, or something close to it. The front door stuck slightly as I opened it, as if the house had one final question it wanted to ask. I didn't answer. I stepped outside into the cold, dragging my suitcase behind me. The car was parked at the edge of the gravel. It took a few minutes for the engine to warm, and during that time, I sat in the driver's seat, staring ahead at the thinning forest. The trees looked bare now, skeletal, their last leaves scattered across the driveway like breadcrumbs left by someone who hoped to return. But I wasn't coming back. I knew that now. As I turned the key and shifted into reverse, the headlights lit up the front porch. For a moment, I thought I saw movement near the window, the suggestion of someone standing just beyond the curtain. A shadow. Or maybe just a trick of the light. I didn't wait to find out. I pulled out slowly, the gravel crunching beneath the tires like bones under pressure. The drive down the hill was quiet. The roads were narrow, still damp from last night's frost. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes forward. There was nothing in the rearview mirror I needed to see. I didn't think about where I was going. Not exactly. I had a direction, not a destination. That felt like enough for now. I wasn't running. I wasn't chasing anything either. I was simply moving, finally, after days of emotional paralysis. It felt right. The small towns passed by in silence, shuttered diners, gas stations still dark, the world not quite awake. I stopped briefly to fill the tank, stepping into the cold morning air and letting it sting my skin. It was strange, being around people again. Strangers who didn't know what I had done, or who I had been a week ago. There was a freedom in that. A weightless anonymity. Back in the car, I opened the windows just a crack, letting the wind in. It carried the scent of pine and damp earth. It cleared my head more than the tea ever had. Hours passed without much thought. Just road and breath and the occasional turn. I didn't listen to music. I didn't want distraction. I needed the hum of the tires, the rhythm of movement, the feeling of distance growing behind me. By early afternoon, I pulled into a rest stop near a wide, empty overlook. The valley stretched below, blanketed in soft fog that curled through the trees like something alive. I sat on a bench near the edge, my suitcase beside me, hands folded in my lap. This was the first time I allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything. Not in pieces, not in silence, but all at once. I thought about my ex-husband, the way he looked at me in those final hours. Not with anger, but with understanding. A kind of letting go. I hadn't deserved that grace, and yet he gave it freely. That would stay with me. Longer than the guilt. I thought about my brother, the way he moved through the house, the quiet manipulation masked as care. I couldn't explain everything that had happened between us. I couldn't even explain what I had allowed. But I knew now that love, in whatever form it once took, wasn't always clean or kind. Sometimes it grew in the cracks of loneliness, twisting itself into something unrecognizable. And I thought about myself. About who I had been when I arrived. About what I had hoped to find. Closure, maybe. Control. Forgiveness. Or at the very least, clarity. But none of those things had arrived. What I had found instead was discomfort, vulnerability, and truth, raw and unpleasant and necessary. I stayed on the bench for a long time, watching the wind move through the trees. No one else came. The world remained distant, indifferent, which somehow felt like permission to be still. Eventually, I stood, stretched my legs, and walked back to the car. I placed the suitcase in the back seat instead of the trunk. I didn't want it hidden away. I wanted to see it. To remember that I had left. As I pulled back onto the road, I didn't look at the map. I let instinct guide me. North, maybe. Or east. Somewhere unfamiliar. The road curved gently along the mountainside. Birds crossed the sky in long, uneven patterns. The clouds had begun to thin, revealing patches of pale blue behind them. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe deeply. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know what kind of life waited for me beyond this drive. But I knew it wouldn't be the one I left behind in that house. I had made choices. I had crossed lines. I had let things happen that I never thought I would. But I had also survived them. And now, I was moving forward. Not with certainty. But with ownership. And sometimes, that's all there is.